Watch an MMA fight closely, and you'll often see a strange transformation. A fighter who was moving freely moments earlier reaches the cage, and suddenly everything changes. Their footwork slows, their attacks become less frequent. Sometimes they appear to simply stand there while their opponent closes in. From the outside, the solution seems obvious. Move sideways, push away, circle back toward the center. Yet even world-class fighters can spend long stretches seemingly trapped against a surface that isn't actually holding them in place. It's tempting to blame exhaustion or hesitation, and sometimes those factors matter. But they don't explain why the same pattern appears repeatedly, even with fresh, experienced fighters. The real difference is mechanical. In open space, a fighter under pressure can retreat, pivot, change angles, or reposition their feet to recover balance. The moment their back reaches the cage, one of those directions disappears. And losing that single direction has consequences throughout the rest of the body, because the cage doesn't need to physically trap someone to restrict them. It only needs to remove the space their body normally uses to solve pressure. So what actually changes the moment that space disappears? The answer begins with balance. Standing still may look passive, but the human body is constantly making tiny corrections to keep its center of mass, the point where its weight is effectively concentrated, over the area supported by its feet. When an outside force disrupts that balance, one of the body's simplest solutions is to step. In open space, a fighter has options. Pressure from the front can be absorbed by moving backward, changing angle, or repositioning the feet before attacking again. These small movements create the space needed to recover posture. Against the cage, that process changes. The backward step simply isn't available. Now, forward pressure cannot be relieved in the easiest direction. The fighter has to redirect it while staying balanced, defending strikes, and possibly dealing with grips or a takedown attempt at the same time. This is why the cage is so useful, even though it isn't actively pushing back. It removes one of the body's natural solutions to losing balance, leaving the opponent to control a much smaller set of possibilities. But one possibility still seems obvious. If backward movement is gone, why can't the fighter simply move sideways? Because moving sideways isn't as simple as taking one step. To escape along the cage, a fighter usually needs to turn their body, reposition their feet, and move their hips and shoulders into a new angle. That creates a brief transition, and transitions are exactly what skilled pressure fighters try to control. Instead of chasing wherever the defender moves, they cut off the route before the escape develops. Foot position can block the direction of the first step. Head and shoulder pressure can make turning uncomfortable or mechanically difficult. In grappling exchanges, an underhook, placing an arm underneath the opponent's arm to control their upper body, can help prevent the shoulders and hips from freely rotating away. This creates an important difference between being near the cage and being controlled against it. The fence removes movement behind the defender, while the attacker positions themselves to interfere with movement toward the sides. Suddenly, the open space that looks obvious to the viewer isn't actually easy to reach. And once the defender's movement becomes restricted, another strange change often appears. Their offense begins disappearing too. Why should being unable to move freely make it so difficult to attack? Because offense depends on something that cage pressure is constantly threatening: a stable base. Powerful movements are rarely produced by the arms alone. A punch, knee, takedown, or even a strong defensive frame depends on the feet, hips, and torso working together. The body needs enough balance to transfer force through that chain. Against the cage, that structure is often compromised. Pressure can leave the defender too upright, folded forward, twisted through the torso, or carrying too much weight on one leg. From those positions, producing force becomes harder because the body is already using its muscles simply to maintain posture. The hands also become occupied. Instead of attacking, they may be fighting grips, creating frames, protecting the head, or defending a takedown. And every attempt to strike can mean temporarily giving up one of those defenses. So what looks like hesitation is often calculation. The fighter isn't necessarily choosing to do nothing. They're trapped in a position where attacking carelessly could make the situation worse. But this creates another question. Maintaining that much control sounds exhausting. So how can an attacker keep someone trapped without constantly using maximum strength? Because effective cage pressure isn't the same thing as pushing as hard as possible. If an attacker simply drives forward with maximum force, the defender can often feel exactly where that force is going and begin working around it. Skilled cage control is more subtle. The attacker uses positioning to make certain directions difficult, then adjusts as the defender searches for another. Head position can interfere with the upper body's rotation, Control around the hips or shoulders can limit how freely the torso turns. Foot placement can close the path the defender needs to circle away. Instead of physically stopping every movement, the attacker only needs to make each escape inconvenient enough that the next threat arrives first. This creates a frustrating cycle. The defender begins moving one way, encounters resistance, changes direction, and finds another problem waiting. Each failed attempt costs energy and, more importantly, time. After enough of these exchanges, hesitation can appear. Not necessarily because the fighter is afraid to move, but because every obvious movement has started producing a predictable consequence. And that's when the position begins to look like something it really isn't: complete paralysis. So when a fighter appears to freeze against the cage, are they actually freezing? Or are their useful choices simply disappearing faster than they can find new ones? What looks like freezing is often the visible result of a fighter running out of good options. The cage itself doesn't immobilize anyone. What it does is remove space. The opponent then uses positioning, pressure, grips, and threats to make the remaining directions increasingly difficult to use. That distinction matters. A fighter may still be physically capable of stepping sideways, throwing a punch, or turning away. But if that step exposes a takedown, the punch sacrifices an important defensive frame, or the turn gives up the back, those movements are no longer attractive solutions. The fighter is still making decisions. The problem is that every decision has become more expensive. And this reveals something fundamental about high-level combat. Control doesn't always mean physically preventing someone from moving. Sometimes the strongest form of control is allowing movement while making every available direction worse than the position they already occupy. Once you recognize that, cage pressure looks completely different. What seemed like one fighter simply pushing another against a fence becomes a battle over space, balance, posture, and choices. That's why fighters can suddenly appear frozen against the cage. They haven't forgotten how to move. Their opponent has simply created a position where knowing where to move is no longer enough.